Recording in progress. Thanks for coming to our bird study group meeting. 35 years of science communication. I am the director of the bird study group, and I'm honored that you're joining us tonight. The Hamilton Naturalist Club recognizes the history of First Nations and Métis people in the province of Ontario, and pays respects to the Six Nations in the Grand River Territory and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the holder of the treaty with the Crown for the lands that we steward. I'm speaking to you today from the Strathcona neighborhood in Hamilton, which is the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat nations. And I'm excited to have a special guest tonight, which I will be announcing shortly, who is going to be talking to us about a bird that's existed here for a very long time, went away, and is now back. Thanks to humans. They went away and came back thanks to people, but I won't talk much about it because we'll let our expert do that. If this is your first time joining us, this is a monthly webinar, something that we were doing in person for the longest time, and of course now we can't, and because of the latest trends, we likely won't be meeting in person for a while. So thank you for continuing to join us virtually. Happy to still be able to do this. We like to try and bring everyone together. Any level of birding that you consider yourself, whatever level of birder you are, these webinars are for you and for your friends and for anybody. Even Winnipeg Blue Bombers fans. We welcome Bombers fans here. I'm a little hoarse today. I was gifted a ticket. My mom surprised me with a Grey Cup ticket, and I went to the Grey Cup last night. And I was screaming a lot. When Winnipeg was on offense, and I don't think I screamed loud enough because it didn't work out in our favor, as we all know. So if I'm a little raspy, if I'm a little woozy, it may have to do with the Grey Cup. But I digress. So if you're just joining us, these programs last until about 9 o'clock, sometimes a little bit before. I usually give some announcements off the top before introducing the speaker, and the speaker has anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour with some Q&A. So feel free to use the chat to communicate with us, and use the Q&A function as well if you have any questions, but we'll be monitoring both. And if you watched the game last night or also were at the Grey Cup, feel free to let us know in the chat. We do our best to try and bring communities together, to bring people together over one common goal. We recognize how important it is to be observing and noting what is occurring in nature, whether you're a designated professional working in the industry or you're a hobbyist. We're all in this for something greater than us. And there's been a lot going on in the Hamilton area, in the HSA, in the 40-kilometer radius from Dunder and Castle. So as of December 1st, winter listing begins. Are you a winter lister? A friend of mine is trying to get me onto it. I haven't delved into that necessarily, but I'd be curious to know if others are winter listers. So a Western meadowlark has been kind of the big eye popper these days. King eiders are being seen in the HSA in terms of birds on the move. I have a question that I think will be answered in a couple months, but I'm trying to figure out what determines an eruption year for certain species. And we've been seeing, I just wrote a question mark there. Eruption, like, are we about to see one? Is this the start of one? There was one day last week where there were 4 snowy owls seen around the bay in one day. And there was several others in the HSA, so that's pretty neat. A photo of a Townsend solitaire by Marcus Legstons, who captured this kind of one-day wonder. I don't hear of many Townsend solitaires showing up around here, so it's pretty cool that that one was around. Snow geese, an occasional white-winged crossbill. Harris sparrow continues, Harris sparrow. Northern shrike is becoming a bit more prevalent in its usual haunt of the Gates of Heaven cemetery. So what are you seeing? What are you noting out there? And I'd like to know too, do you have a bird that you want to see before the end of the year? Is there one thing before 2021 is up that you are hoping to see? Let us know. If you're commenting, if you're writing in the chat, you can click that little 2 button. It says hosts and panelists. Make sure you've clicked everyone so that everyone gets a chance to see it. I would love to know what you're seeing and what you would still like to see before the year's up. I personally would love to see a rough-legged hawk. I haven't seen one in the HSA in a few years. And I know that James Lee's had a very close encounter with one. If you're following him on social media, look at the pictures he got of one. They look incredible. So I'm hoping to see a rough-legged hawk personally. Last month I talked about the pipits, and I'll continue to talk about pipits because it's a great group for beginner birders and intermediate and expert birders alike. The pipits meet every Sunday in person, and they meet virtually every Tuesday. So you can reach out to Colleen+2@gmail.com. It's Colleen Riley, and she will be able to give you the details on joining that great group. But the Christmas bird count is coming up, and there was a really lengthy but thorough, and so I don't mean to say that despairingly or anything. There was a great email from Rob Porter about the Christmas bird count and the process by which that is occurring this year and the growth of their committee. So if you're able to take part in the Christmas bird count, I'm gonna put that, unless Rob is here now and can do it, or someone on the committee can do it, to put the registration form in the chat tonight so folks know where to go to sign up for any of these counts. So that the Hamilton Christmas bird count, the Peachtree count, which is Grimsby, or the new Flamborough count. You can see this map here kind of indicates the Flamborough patches. So we'd love to have you out for any of those counts. So there is the registration form, but you can email hamilton.bird.count@gmail.com if you have any questions or comments. A lot of local birding resources for you and several birding groups. And so if you ever hear of one, or you want to promote an Instagram page, a Facebook page, a Discord channel, the Hamilton Naturalist Club has stuff across the board. Ontario Birds, run by the Ontario Field Ornithologists, they've got a lot on the go. The Songbirding podcast, which according to my Spotify playlist was my most listened to podcast in 2021. And the local birding groups, there's something I want to chat about in a sec, mainly about the Bird Friendly Cities Hamilton Burlington Coalition. So did you know that the city of Hamilton or the city of Burlington don't have an official city bird? Neither municipality do, but that is about to change. So shortly, I'm going to put, and again, unless there's a Bird Friendly City member in the webinar tonight and can put this in the chat, I'll put it in a few minutes. There is a form where you can fill out what you believe Hamilton's city bird should be. Same with the city of Burlington's city bird. Pick a native bird to the area, let them know why it is you've picked that bird, and there's a formal process for it, but right now is kind of the public opening of it. So if you think that a bird ought to represent the city of Hamilton, let us know. Let the Bird Friendly Cities group know, and same with the city of Burlington. And there's a lot of options out there, so dig deep. If you're not a member of the Hamilton Naturalist Club, we'd love for you to be. If you are looking to get involved with the club on a volunteer basis, there are options to do so. And so you can join the club by emailing treasurer@hamiltonnature.org, by emailing membership@hamiltonnature.org, or volunteering by emailing volunteer@hamiltonnature.org. We are hopefully in the new year going to be revamping our website and having it be a more functional page. It's gonna take some thought and some time and some dollars, but we hope to do that for you, for everybody, real soon. That being said, we, as the board, so I'm on the board of directors with the Hamilton Naturalist Club, as well as a good dozen other folks. We're looking for someone to kind of step in as a communications director and to liaise with a few folks who we've hired, and as well just kind of keep things in mind when it comes to the communication efforts of the Hamilton Naturalist Club. And we have an outgoing director, the conservation and education director is stepping away, Gordon McNulty. So we're looking for someone who has a mind about what's happening to the land around us, who understands what's happening with municipalities and how they function. We'd love to have your expertise joining us for the next couple of years as we see the city of Hamilton and the region go through major changes. So let us know. We'd love to know what you'd like to do. And again, if you have a project, an event, a program, a survey, you name it, something that you would like to have promoted, you can reach out to me, birdstudygroup@hamiltonnature.org, or a host of other folks. We will do our best to promote it, because that's what we should be about. I've filled up the special guests for the next 4 months. So we are going to hear from Scott from Project Snowstorm in February. We're going to hear from the Bird Friendly Cities team in March to let us know about what's been going on with them in the last year. A lot of growth with that group, which is really cool. The Feminist Bird Club is going to be presenting to us in April, and that's the Toronto chapter, who has members living in the city of Hamilton. And May will do like a community round circle like we did last year, and talk a little bit about likely some awards like Bird of the Year. The American Birding Association is looking to announce their Bird of the Year. My hat goes off to folks who will pick the Bird of the Year. How do you, like, the criteria must be massive to pick the Bird of the Year. And next month our meeting is gonna have a very special guest, a special guest to me anyway. This is my cousin Jane. So she's going to be talking to us about bringing hope back to the Alvars, the latest on the recovery story of the Eastern Loggerhead Shrike. So that's going to be our January, on the 15th January. So we're very excited to bring Jane back. Jane's been married, but she did speak with us a couple years ago at the Burlington Senior Center. So we're looking forward to having Jane let us know all about what her work has been up to as it pertains to the loggerhead shrike. And the inside scoop on a shrike sighting in the Niagara region earlier this fall that sent birders flocking. I must not be tuned into what's going on in the Niagara region to know what that is even hinting at. So I'm looking forward to hearing about that. All right, but with that said, I would like to welcome our special guest, one Mrs. Jenn Baici, I should say. Jenn is currently a Ph.D. candidate at Trent University studying the social structure and behaviors of wild turkeys. She has previously studied biocontrol of invasive species in New York region and big cat conservation in South America. That's a whole presentation unto itself, I think. She's toward the end of her Ph.D., so soon to be Dr. Jenn Baici. So these days she is teaching several university courses on plant ecology and physiology while she writes up her turkey research. I'm excited to learn all about WITU tonight, wild turkey. So let's put our hands together for Jenn Baici. Jenn, thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Jackson. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I will go ahead and share my screen here with sound, since I have some videos for you folks tonight. Okay, how does that looking? Looks good? Okay, awesome, great. So as Jackson said, I study wild turkeys. My research primarily focuses on sort of social structure and behavior. And tonight I'm going to talk about what my research has sort of centered around for the past several years, and also how turkey behavior and my behavior as a turkey researcher has to change with the seasons in Ontario, since we do have this sort of seasonality that animals have to endure in Ontario. And so the title of my talk tonight is Wild Turkeys: A Year in the Life. And I always like to start this talk off by talking about the history of wild turkeys in Ontario, since they do have a unique history in that they were hunted to extirpation in Ontario in the early 1900s. So we estimate around 1909 is when they were truly extirpated from the province. And this was a result primarily of overhunting as well as habitat loss occurring at the same time. So European colonizers arrived and discovered that turkeys were extremely delicious and easy to harvest, and accidentally hunted them to extinction. And it was that way in Ontario where we did not have any turkeys at all until the sort of mid 1980s, when wildlife researchers and practitioners decided that it would be worth a try to sort of come together and try to reintroduce this species to Ontario. And so that's what they did by trading moose, river otter, and also grouse for wild turkeys from a number of different states in the US. So we sort of gathered individuals from different healthy populations in the States, and we gave them moose and otter from our healthy populations up in Canada. And by the end of 1986, a total of 4,400 individuals had been reintroduced. So we did sort of a number of these wildlife swaps and resulted in this sort of new foundation population of 4,400 individuals. And then if we fast forward to 2007, when the most recent management plan for the species was published, it was estimated that there are about 70,000 individuals now. My research estimates that that number is actually a little bit lower, but they're still sort of thriving nonetheless. So we have a very healthy, likely increasing turkey population in Ontario today because of these reintroduction efforts in the 80s. And in addition tonight rather, to talking about sort of wild turkey behavior and how it changes with this seasonality, I also want to touch on 3 reasons why I think it's really important to study wild turkeys, particularly in Ontario. And the first being that they were hunted to extirpation. And so we have this sort of unique opportunity to study how their population has grown and changed since their reintroduction, and also how to sort of ensure that we don't accidentally overharvest them again. So that's the first reason sort of why I think that this species is an important sort of research focus in the province. Some of you may have seen this poster. I sent it around to just about every sort of nature club and naturalist group that I could find in Ontario back in 2017, 2018, going into 2019 when I did this research. So I circulated this poster and gathered as many wild turkey observations as I could from across the province. And this was to help us update that wild turkey population size number, since, as I said, the most recent estimate was published in 2007, so it's a little bit outdated now. And from this community science campaign, so we sent around this poster and advertised it as widely as we could, and we requested that participants submit observations either through eBird or iNaturalist, so either of those platforms, depending on which one participants were more comfortable with. And this is what the data looks like after we plot it. So we had this campaign running for the entire winter season, a little bit longer than the winter, starting sort of beginning of December rather than the true first day of winter. But these are the wild turkey observations that we gathered from across Ontario. So we can see some down here in Hamilton, which is very interesting to me. I think all of those sort of urban turkey observations are extra interesting. We even got some in Toronto. All of the pink dots on this map here are observations through eBird, and then the yellow are through iNaturalist. So sort of as expected, we got a lot more observations through eBird. I think more people are comfortable using that platform, especially for bird observations, but we did get a few unique observations through iNaturalist. And these are just flock observations, so these don't take into account a number of individuals. This is just sort of where the flocks are. Of sort of an interesting note is the furthest north that we saw observations, which was up in Sault Ste. Marie, and then the furthest south, which is down on Point Pelee. Up in Sault Ste. Marie here, the turkeys didn't necessarily migrate up there on their own, but they were reintroduced up on St. Joe's Island up there and have been able to persist. So when wildlife practitioners in the 80s were reintroducing wild turkeys, they sort of put them in a few areas to see how well they did. And some of those areas were further north than their historic range, or what we thought to be their historic range. But that population, for instance, has been able to persist up there. And with this information, so we can not only get sort of a population size estimate from information like this, but we can also predict habitat suitability based on where we're seeing turkeys and where we're not seeing turkeys. So that's what this map is here. I'm working on publishing this map right now and sort of publishing an updated wild turkey population size estimate. But here we can see the red areas on this map sort of plotted on top of our base map are areas of really high habitat suitability. And then the blue are areas of really low. And then green here are sort of intermediate. And so interestingly enough, we do see that my predicted habitat suitability is sort of higher around Hamilton and some of these urban areas than we would expect. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few slides, but it's likely because of the resources that wild turkeys are taking advantage of. So this map here takes into account things like snow depth, temperature, and then resources such as food and habitat available to those species. And so getting into the sort of year of the life of this species, I like to start this talk in the winter. And that's because that's when I first started studying wild turkeys, was in January 2017. And this is also when we trap wild turkeys. So this is when sort of the research on those individuals begins, is in the winter time, once we're able to put GPS tags on them. And so this is a video from one of my trail cams. This is sort of typical turkey behavior that we would expect to see in the winter. So they're grouped up in flocks. They're typically congregated around food sources. In this case, this is a supplemental food source that I've put down for them. So it's a pile of corn. Wild turkeys are very corn motivated, especially in the winter time. And so we can kind of move them through the landscape using trails of corn as we need to for our trapping sort of trap day plans. But yeah, this is sort of typical turkey behavior in the wintertime. So congregating around food sources and present in big flocks in the landscape. We also see that in addition to corn, so agricultural operations, things like that, they also take advantage of other supplemental food sources like bird feeders. So here's a photo of a turkey. My lab mate took this photo for me at her cottage just in Buckthorn near Peterborough, if any of you are familiar with where that is. So this turkey's hopped right up on her second-story balcony to get to this bird feeder. Hopped, I say hopped, probably a fly hop up there. And then here's another one. So this turkey was in Toronto. I believe that this is the same turkey that was spotted in Christie Pits a few times, if any of you are familiar with that bird. But there are a few turkeys that are sort of well-known in Toronto. They've become turkey famous. So those are those supplemental food sources that I was referring to in those urban areas. And we take advantage of the fact that wild turkeys are so motivated in the wintertime because their natural food sources are sort of less available to them. We take advantage of that in the way that we trap them. So when I go about sort of looking for an area to trap turkeys, of course, I'm looking for the turkeys themselves. So I want to see them and know where they are, make sure that they're there before we make a trap plan. Also, I'm looking for evidence like this. So turkey tracks in the snow means that it's probably an area that they're visiting more than once. Turkeys are very routine in their behaviors. And so in addition to the birds themselves, I'm also looking for sort of other evidence that turkeys might be around, like these meandering turkey paths that we see in the snow. And then I'm also looking for a big open area. So I want to see turkeys in a big open field, evidence that they're going back there day after day. And I want it to be a big open space because of the equipment that we use to trap them. So we use something called a rocket net. Here's my diagram here. I'll just go back to that slide in a second. But we use a rocket net, and that detonates out of what we call the net box down at the bottom using little packets of rocket powder or gunpowder. And it shoots it out of the box, flies over on top of the flock, it falls on top of the flock, and then that's how we capture the turkeys. And I'll just go back to show you this path here. So as I said, we use that sort of corn and their food motivation to our benefit, in that we can make these little paths through the fields and encourage turkeys to follow these paths and spend time at these sort of tight clustered food sources so that we can catch many of them at once. And so that's what we see here. We see this path that I've stomped down through the snow. I've made it easier for them to walk through the snow, which also encourages them to go that way. And then I've put some corn kernels along that path to encourage them to go out into the middle of that open field where it can capture them. And that's what's waiting for them at the end of the path, is that nice big pile of corn. And so here's a video of the net detonating. Jackson let me know that this is a bit choppy, so I'm going to play it anyways, but if it comes across a bit choppy, I apologize. I'll describe what's happening anyways, but it might be a bit loud as well. So that's the net detonating. I'll play it one more time just in case that comes across as not choppy for anyone. But we see the turkeys sprinkled out in the field there, and then the net detonating over the flock. And so what I'm waiting for there to detonate the net is I'm waiting to make sure that all the birds are tightly clustered. We're going to catch as many as possible. And I also am waiting to make sure that all of their heads are down because we don't want any injuries from using equipment like this. So there's a few kind of key things I'm looking for when we're trapping in the turkey behavior. And in this particular instance, we also put a GoPro on my supervisor's helmet to film our sort of journey to catching the turkeys. And so after the net detonates, we have here my supervisor, Dr. Jeff Bowman with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resource and Forestry was the previous acronym. I can never remember the new one, but this is him running towards the turkeys. So you can see them hopping around under the net, kind of like popcorn. And he's running full speed towards them because we don't want any of them to hop out from under the net. We also don't want them to injure themselves while they're under the net. So while they're doing that sort of flapping and frantically trying to get away, they sometimes lose feathers. And so we want to keep them sort of as calm and contained as possible. And so in this video, my colleague Lizzie and I and Jeff are getting the turkeys a little bit more tangled in that net. If any of you have ever done any mist netting or anything like that, then you can imagine this is very similar, but on a much larger scale. And so once we have the turkeys out from under the net, we put them all in their own sort of turkey-shaped box. These boxes come special from the National Wild Turkey Federation in the United States. And here my supervisor, Jeff, again, is taking a turkey out of that perfect turkey-sized box. And what I'm about to do is put a sock on that turkey's head. We use black socks, and that covers the light for them. So once they are no longer able to see sort of their environment, they're no longer able to see us, they calm right down. And so they stop flapping, they stop trying to get away because they can no longer sort of sense that sense of freedom. And so it actually calms them down and keeps them sort of safer during the processing because we don't want them flapping around and stressing the entire time we're processing them. And so once we have them a bit calmer and that sock on their head, then we take a number of measurements. So here in this video, again, I've just got a GoPro resting on the side of the truck there. And here I'm taking measurements of tarsus length, for instance. So on turkeys, that would be sort of like their shin. I also take wing measurements, wing length, head length. On males, I'm going to take beard length. So males have these long beards. I've got some photos of those that I can show you in just a few minutes. And then I'm also fitting them with GPS transmitters and metal bands. So this is what the GPS transmitters look like that we've been fitting the turkeys with. They wear them sort of like a backpack. So it sits flat in between their wings, just between their shoulder blades. And it is a bungee harness. So they still have tons of room to sort of open their wings and flap. But it's not sort of rubbing in any kind of way that they're going to get weird bald patches or anything like that. And these GPS transmitters, we can set them to take fixes at different intervals. And so these ones, for instance, are set to take a fix every 4 hours, and then we can kind of infer a map from there of where the turkey's gone. And then these are what the metal bands look like, or the color bands. So we have an aluminum band on one leg, and then we have a color band on the other leg. And this just helps us ID individuals from a distance. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with color banding, especially on smaller birds. On turkeys, I have worked with smaller birds in the past and done some resighting projects. And so I thought that it would be interesting to try to do color bands on turkeys. But because they spend so much time on the ground, it's actually very difficult to resight their color bands because their legs are sort of always buried in the snow or just tall vegetation. And so we did use color bands, but I can't recommend that in terms of a way to resight turkeys. And then once we have all the measurements that we need, We'll take a blood sample for genetic information. They've got their new accessories, so their tracker and their metal bands. Then we release them. And we release them all together at the end of the day. So we trap them together and we release them together in that same group, again, just to minimize any stress associated with trapping. So here we'll see everyone open up their turkey boxes. You'll notice the bird in the middle, I think it's the bird in the middle, is facing the wrong way. There's always one that takes a little bit longer than the rest of them. But you'll see them all sort of run and fly away nicely, which is exactly what we want to see. We want to see at the end of the day, they're good to go, trying to get away from us as fast as possible. Yeah, so that bird in the middle takes a second longer. So then they are sort of out free in the landscape, and then it's up to me to track them for the rest of the year. So I follow them with my tracking equipment, and I'll collect data from them as they move through the landscape and do their turkey thing. Here's another photo of a bird being released. Here we can see the GPS transmitter on the back nicely and that antenna sticking up. Here again, we can kind of see that color band on the leg at the back there and the tracker on the back as well. And so this is what the GPS data looks like when we put it on a map. So this, as I said, is about every 4 hours of a fixed interval. You can do it much more frequently and get a sort of even more fine-scale movement path. But for us, it's always a trade-off between battery and data. So we wanted the transmitters to last at least a year. And so this was the best way for us to do that. This was sort of the most sort of effective in terms of that trade-off between battery life and information. We chose to do a 4-hour fixed interval. And so here, Trent University is actually on this map just down here along the river there. And in addition to those static maps and seeing how turkeys interact with their environment just on a sort of static base map, we can also do things like calculate home range size. So here we have this 95% home range, so almost all the area that the bird goes, and then this pink and white represents more of a core use area. So we can make inferences about how they're using the space and how they're spending their time in their environment. We can also make these more sort of fun movement maps where we actually can follow their path. So this is a male during the winter time in 2018. And we can see he's really not moving very far. I recognize I don't have a scale bar on this map, but he's probably not moving more than 100 meters a day at most. This bird, I'm very familiar with bird 18 here, and he roosts right close to a bird feeder. So especially in the wintertime, he does not have to travel very far. He kind of moves from his roost tree to the bird feeder and back to the roost tree. A few times he jets across the street here. There's a big open field, so perhaps he's going to take advantage of some agricultural resources there. And then here we have a female's movement during the same time of year. And again, we see she's not moving very far. Here on the right-hand side of this road is a farm. He's got cattle there, and so he's got a big pile of corn-filled cattle manure at all times, and there's also some cornfields in the area. So again, this female is pretty much traveling from her roost tree to that pile of corn and then back to her roost tree for most of the winter. And these birds, of course, are not alone. They're going to be with larger flocks. So this large flock would be moving from their roost tree to the corn and back to the roost tree. And with that, I would like to sort of transition into talking about wild turkeys in the springtime. So in the spring is sort of when, instead of in those large, big wintering flocks that turkeys spend time in, they start to disperse. And so here we see some sort of typical turkey behavior in the springtime. Of course, we're used to, or in the springtime, we imagine those turkeys with their big, beautiful tails showing. And I'm not sure if you folks were able to hear, but we hear some gobbling in the background of this video as well. So this is sort of towards the end of the winter, still a bit of snow on the ground, but these males are already displaying and are already thinking about mating season, which is primarily what turkeys are doing in the early spring, is mating. Males are going to be dispersing through the landscape to look for females, and then females are going to be dispersing through the landscape to look for males. So both sexes are dispersing at that time of year. And these two handsome males. This guy here pecking at the corn is a jake. He's got a short stubby beard, but this individual back here is a hen. And so these males are courting that hen back there. Which brings me to the second reason that I think that wild turkeys are an important species for us to study, especially in Ontario. So in addition to mating season during the spring, it's also when in most wildlife management units, you are able to harvest wild turkeys. And so in the beginning, I said colonizers that arrived to Canada in the early 1900s accidentally hunted turkeys to extirpation in the province. And because they're a harvested game species, again, we want to make sure that that definitely doesn't happen again. We don't want to repeat sort of mistakes that have been made through history. And so that's another reason why I think it's incredibly important that we continue to study the species. The population seems to be growing and thriving, but understanding exactly how many individuals we're harvesting, the proportion of the population that they represent, and what that means for the population is very important to ensuring their persistence in the province. So in addition to sort of mating season, I also think of spring as turkey harvest season. After mating comes nesting, which is probably my favorite time to study wild turkeys. Looking for their nests is always such a treasure hunt for me. And they choose a very sort of diverse types of habitat to nest in. So on the left here, we see a hen that's chosen some dry vegetation to nest underneath, and there's sort of some tall grass that's fallen over top. And it's relatively difficult to see those eggs. You know, an aerial predator who was up a bit higher than I was probably would miss that if they were just flying over. Whereas on the right, we have a hen that nested in a young cedar forest with very little aerial cover. So very diverse in terms of the types of habitat that they choose to nest in. And they'll lay anywhere between 9 and 13 eggs. I've seen as little as 7, and 13 is the most that I've seen. And typically they all hatch. There might be 1 or 2 that don't hatch, but for the most part, all of the eggs typically hatch in a clutch. Here we have a few more nests. So on the left, we have evidence of a nest that's been predated. So some kind of ground predators likely got into this nest, maybe a fox or raccoon. We know it's predated because of the eggs and the damage that's been done to the eggs. So there's a very specific pattern when baby birds hatch out of eggs versus when they're predated. I've tried to do a little bit of research into investigating whether or not we can figure out the predator from the damage to the eggs, but that's a tricky one. Other researchers have looked into that as well, and it seems that it might be just a bit too challenging to look to egg fragments to find out the mystery. But we do know some species that are common turkey nest predators like foxes and raccoons. And on the right here, we have the same. So this nest also has been predated. We see some damage to this egg here, maybe a smaller predator since they don't seem to have taken all of the eggs in this case. And during the springtime, this is what their movements typically look like. So on the left, we have that same male from the wintertime in the same space. Now we can see he's shooting across that road much more often. He's moving across into this other field across the road as well. So definitely more movement and more dispersal through the landscape in the springtime. It's also easier for them to move through the landscape when there's less deep snow. And so it makes sense that we would see more movement as that snow begins to melt and temperatures begin to rise. And same thing we see on the right. So this is that same female from before, bird 38. And we see that she's moving a lot further during the springtime as well. So she's moving sort of much more on this right side of the road, and she's shooting back and forth much further distances now than she was during the winter time. Bird 38. Oh, this isn't bird 38. This is another hen. Bird 38, I'll tell you a story about in just the next slide. But this is another hen here. And so here I just wanted to demonstrate how well they are at hiding, how well they do at hiding their nests rather. So here on the left, you can see my foot at the bottom for scale. I'm standing right above this nest. And the only way that I'm able to know that there's a nest there is by looking at the GPS fixes. So sometimes I would listen to their GPS transmitter. I use a receiver and I can hear the beeps, and that tells me what direction she's in. But honing in on those nests can be very challenging, especially if the hen hears me coming or sees me coming and she gets up and moves off the nest. Then I'm no longer tracking the nest, I'm tracking a moving object. So I typically am looking to those GPS fixes to find a nest. In this case, looking down, we don't see any evidence of the nest at all in the left photo. So to aerial predators, even some ground predators. This nest is very well hidden, but then if we look a bit closer, we do see that there's actually how many eggs there? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 relatively large eggs just hidden in the vegetation down there. So they do an incredible job at hiding their nests. These are the movements for bird 38. So as I said, I looked towards these GPS points to help me find the nest. In this case, we see the two sort of tight clusters on the left-hand side here. Those represent roost trees. So she's going back to the same tree to sleep every night. But on the right, there's some tight clusters of points that looked to me, when I put them on top of a sort of base map with satellite imagery, that they might be a nest just based on habitat. And so what I typically do then is I'll go and investigate that spot. For bird 38, this is what that spot looked like. So this is very tall thistle plants, taller than me, probably the tallest thistles I've ever seen. And this was actually also surrounded by an electric fence because this nest was in a cattle pasture. And so the farmer was protecting his cattle from these thistles by sort of putting an electric fence all around it. So this bird not only had chosen an incredibly prickly spot to have her nest, but also protected by an electric fence. And then once I moved in, I was able to find her eggs as well. But finding nests can be sort of one of the most fun, but one of the trickiest parts of tracking turkeys, I would say, because those hens are very good at hiding their nests and eggs. And so moving into the summertime then, once those babies have hatched, some of the work that I was doing, in addition to sort of collecting blood samples from individuals when we trapped them during the winter to work out their genetic relationships amongst adults, I was also collecting egg fragments after the poults had hatched and moved away from the nest. So I'm tracking these nests once I find them. I'm going back every so often to see how far along the incubation process she is. After I find the hen, I know roughly how many days should be left during the incubation period. And so I have a date in mind that I think the babies are likely to hatch. And I typically just watch the nest closer as it comes towards that date. Because I want to get the genetic material from those egg fragments when it's as fresh as possible, but I also don't want to disturb the babies. And I don't want to sort of draw any attention towards the nest site because as a bird researcher, we're very aware that predators are always watching us, especially when we find bird nests. And so I want to spend as little time as possible near the nest when there are vulnerable babies or eggs there. So I wait till the poults move away. And that usually happens sort of day 2 after they've hatched, maybe even on the first day, but they leave the nest site pretty quickly after they hatch. And so then I move in and I collect all those egg fragments and I put them in nicely labeled little baggies with each egg separately to make sure that there's no sort of transmission of genetic material across egg fragments. And from there, I'm looking to see 2 things. So wild turkeys exhibit 2 sort of very interesting behaviors in their mating system. The first is that they're not monogamous. So males will mate with more than one female and females will mate with more than one male. And this is a way for them to simply hedge their bets. So if a male mates with a female and he's only mated with one and she's predated, he's lost his opportunity to pass on his genetic material for the whole season. Whereas if he's mated with more than one, he still has some opportunities to pass on his genetic material. And same thing goes for her. So if she mates with a male and it turns out that his genetic material is very poor quality, she's lost her opportunity to reproduce that year if she's only mated with one. So they'll mate with multiples. And then they also do something called conspecific brood parasitism, which is just a fancy term for the fact that they will lay their eggs in one another's nests. So we know this about ducks, for instance. Some duck species do this, geese species do this, some species do this to other bird species, and turkeys will do it to each other. And so these 2 behaviors in combination means that in one nest, you could have genetic material from more than one mom and from more than one dad. And so I'm collecting those egg fragments to see sort of how often is this happening, and do we see nest parasitism in this region? We don't know yet. We know that wild turkeys do this in California. We have some genetic information, but We don't know here, so that's why I've been collecting these egg fragments, and I should have the data back before Christmas, I've been promised. So we'll know soon whether or not they are sneakily laying eggs in one another's nests in the Peterborough area. Just another photo of turkey poults. This is what they look like when they're babies. So this is probably just before they're learning to fly, maybe a week and a half old at this point. They're precocial, so they come out fluffy, good to go. They can run around on the ground and feed themselves. And mom typically keeps them in tall grass, very well hidden during this time of their life because they are so vulnerable. Then here we see bird 38 in the summertime. So this is after her nest has hatched, that nest well protected by that big thistle patch. This is after all those eggs have hatched and she's got poults. So now she's spending time in tall grass, as I said, to keep those babies really well hidden. Something else that female turkeys do is they will sort of form family groups. So sometimes you'll see more than one hen with a sort of big group of babies. This becomes even more of an interesting observation once we know that sometimes they lay eggs in one another's nests. So there might be some sort of cooperative breeding and cooperative brood rearing happening here, which is very interesting. And so her priority during this time of year is sort of keeping those poults alive and fed, keeping them in a habitat that's got lots of important food sources for growing turkeys. So lots of insects at this life stage. They're needing lots of protein and nutrients as they grow. Here we have bird 18 during the summertime. Males do not contribute to parental care in this species, so they mate and then their job's done. Females are typically not spending time with adult males during the summertime when they have those poults. They're typically spending time with other females, maybe juvenile males, but typically you see female-only groups, and then smaller male-only groups or single males is typically what you'll see in the summertime. So they're sort of still enjoying all those natural food sources that are available to them and moving through the landscape quite easily as there's no snow yet. And then if we move into autumn, so here I have a beautiful male tom. As I said, I would show you some pictures of toms with nice long beards. This male's probably 3 or 4, so definitely a mature adult, beautiful long beard. We can see his antenna from his GPS transmitter there. This guy has lost both of his metal bands on his legs. I don't know how they do it, but there's some turkeys that lose their metal bands every year. But this is one of my tracked birds that I had tracked for several years. Here's another photo of this stunning boy. You can also see his spurs here on his legs. So they use these structures when they are fighting, quote unquote, fighting over females. So they'll do that to sort of antagonize one another if there's any conflict over access to a female for mating. During this time of year, wild turkeys are still taking advantage of those supplemental food sources in the landscape. So during the autumn, you'll often see them in cornfields after corn's been harvested. So they're taking advantage of that waste grain. They'll also spend lots of time in soybean fields, same thing, taking advantage of sort of waste crop that's been left behind or fallen from the plant. Here we have another photo of this individual running through the cornfields. In the fall, you sometimes have a little bit of snow, but typically not a lot of snow cover in Peterborough in the fall yet. But yeah, they're spending time in cornfields. There's some research to suggest that wild turkeys are not pest to crops necessarily. They typically only do eat that waste grain. We know that because of the proportion of sort of total matter that it makes up in their stomachs. We also know that they can actually be beneficial to crops and that they eat a lot of crop pests. So you'll often hear farmers talk about turkeys being pests to their crops and they're spending a lot of time in their cornfields, but we know that turkeys actually are eating mostly insects out of those cornfields, a little bit of waste grain on the ground, but they're not typically doing that primary damage to the crops. And some natural food sources that turkeys are taking advantage of. So I mentioned all those supplemental food sources. So corn is a huge one, as well as bird feeders in urban areas. They're also going to eat insects. So they're very opportunistic in that sense. They're kind of walking along and pecking what's available to them. Soft-bodied insects, definitely. So caterpillars and cocoon, things like that. Plant parts, they're going to eat seeds, berries. Wild grape is a great food source for wild turkeys, acorns, and lots of those sort of forest food sources as well. Wild turkeys are considered a forest generalist, and so they'll eat sort of beach seeds, acorns, any of those tree sort of forest food sources as well. And in addition to food sources, there's sort of a lot of other interesting and intricate connections that wild turkeys have with their food web in Ontario that were probably disrupted when they were hunted to extinction. And I imagine are starting to bounce back and kind of reach more of an equilibrium, more of a natural sort of interaction with their ecosystem now. Some of those natural interactions, in addition to those food sources I mentioned, you know, they're sort of controlling those populations as a top-down individual, but they're also providing a food source for species like coyotes in urban areas, larger birds of prey. So perhaps not in Peterborough, maybe in Peterborough, but wild turkeys roosting at the top of trees make great prey for larger owls. So great horned owls, for instance, there's lots of cases of great horns predating turkeys in the southern states. I say perhaps not here because they're quite close in size in this part of their range, but a small hen, we've had hens that are sort of 3 pounds. So a bird like that would definitely make a great prey item for a larger bird of prey. In addition, these species are also going to take advantage of any turkey nests they find on the ground, foxes as well. I'll call the hens during their nesting season sort of food sitting on food. So they provide a lot of nutrients for the ecosystem in addition to being a part of that their own sort of ecosystem and controlling those plant populations and insect populations. They're roosting in trees. So this isn't a trophic interaction, of course, but them sitting in those trees, their poop falling to the ground and their feathers falling to the ground day after day is definitely going to have some sort of impact on that forest ecosystem. So an introduction of nutrients through their poop falling to the ground, things like that. And we know that they use their roost trees very heavily. So they will change their roost, but when they find a tree they like, they'll sleep in that tree for months on end every night. And so the impact of all that poop falling to the ground can be quite substantial. And then, as I said, all those plant parts and insects that they're eating and taking care of in the ecosystem for us. And so there's lots of connections. These are just sort of a handful of them, but they are a very intricate part of our ecosystem, a part that was missing for quite a few years. And so understanding all of those connections and fostering those connections is also a really important reason why we should continue to support wild turkey research in the province of Ontario. And with that, I would like to say thank you so much for Jackson for inviting me tonight and for all of you for spending your evening listening to me talk about my turkey research. And I'm more than happy to take any questions now that you have.
That was awesome, Jen. I was sharing with someone that I guess I just didn't know enough about turkeys. And I was so excited to know that you and your research exist and that this presentation exists and you're able to give it to us.
Thank you.
So yeah, incredible work, incredible research. There are some questions. I've opened up Birds of Hamilton by Bob Curry, which I don't know if you addressed this in your research at all. There's some really cool facts in here, but the only one I really wanted to mention, because this is a challenge to the birders of Hamilton. Wild turkeys are now recorded annually on the Hamilton Christmas bird count. 51 were counted on 26 December in 2005. So 51. So Hamilton's record is to beat 51 turkeys counted this Christmas bird count.
I think that you guys can do it. I think that there are a lot of turkeys in Hamilton.
Yeah, plenty of turkeys. There's 4 or 5 that hang out near where I work every day. Yeah, there's plenty around. So lots of questions coming in. They're mostly in the chat. I don't think anyone has put any in the Q&A, which is fine. So Charlene asks, how long did that GPS map take to make? How many 4-hour intervals?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, so that was the movement ones that I was showing were for about 4 months. Those were seasonal snapshots. Yeah, so that's about 4 months worth of data. That's a great question, though.
I think she asked that question before you showed the animation.
Oh, okay.
Ones, if that makes sense to your
yeah
to your presentation. Yeah, the stationary map specifically is the one she's wondering about, or that they're wondering about.
Okay, so this one here, perhaps. Yeah, so this is, yeah, probably again about 4 months worth of data. Yeah. Yeah, that'll be 4 months worth of data. It's probably during the winter time. I think that's the same data here. Yeah, so during the winter time. So we see some tight clusters, but they're not moving too far in the landscape during this time. This might even be longer than 4 months, maybe like half the year.
And those are all banded turkeys. Those are all banded wild turkeys. Each dot represents that.
Each dot, so this is data from one individual. Each dot represents a fix. So each dot represents a time that the turkey was there.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah.
Okay. Peter Tome. Do dominant males control a large harem and leave the younger males out of luck, or do they create small family groups, one male with only 1 or 2 females?
Yeah, that's another great question. So typically what we see in wild turkeys is they have these courtship groups. So sibling brothers will typically court together. And so on that trail cam video, you saw 2 individuals displaying at once. It's likely that they were brothers, and one is going to mate and the other one will not. And so sometimes you'll see groups of 3 or even 4 males displaying together, and that's the same thing. So it'll be sibling groups. And the reason that males will sort of assist their brothers in displaying in that way is that the feeling is that if you're not going to mate, so perhaps there's other males that are in the flock that are bigger than you, you've sort of established that you're likely not going to mate because of your rank in the flock. It's better for you to assist your brother, in mating, because he's going to pass on some genetic material that you also carry. So it's all about trying to pass on genes, if that makes sense. So that's why you'd want to help your brother rather than a stranger, and rather than not help anyone at all. If your fate is to not mate, it's going to be beneficial for you to help your brother court a female and pass on some of your genetic material that way.
Very cool. Thank you for that. So Colleen wonders, and this was when you were talking about conspecific brood parasitism. She said, I had to write that down. She said, will they continue to look after the nest after predation? Which maybe she means parasite when other eggs are laid there. Thank you.
Yeah.
If some eggs remain, what happens to them?
Yes. So yeah, so I can answer sort of both of those. So if they parasitize the nest, they do it sneakily. So they are doing it in hopes that the hen that's incubating the nest doesn't see them do it. If she does see them do it, that's a good question. I don't think that she would abandon. I think that she would probably continue to incubate, but those hens that are parasitizing are doing their best to do it in a sneaky way. If the nest is predated, the hen is likely to abandon. So if a predator comes and eats 1 or 2 eggs, she's likely to abandon. And that's because she knows now, the predator knows it's there. So if she continues to incubate, there's nothing to say that same predator is going to come back the next day and take the rest of the eggs. And then she's sort of wasted time and energy on that nest that now is lost cause. So if it's predated, she's likely to abandon. If it's parasitized, she's likely to stay.
Cool.
Yeah.
Which is likely why they make their nests in such huge thicket patches. Holy moly. Like,
yes.
Like anything could fit through there, let alone a huge turkey.
Yeah. I know, it's pretty amazing.
Where have there been other interesting nests that you've encountered that you wouldn't think would be a nest?
There was one behind a giant tiger just outside of town. So just beside the parking lot, really close by to all, cars coming inside in and out in carts, and really loud. So there was one there that was pretty surprising to me. And then there was one that was in behind a summer camp, which I also thought was really surprising because there's kind of screaming kids running around all day. But she was just a few meters off the path, very well hidden. But yeah, super close by to a summer camp. So kind of right under our noses in a way, which is funny.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, the questions continue to arrive. What's the impact of wild turkeys on small hurt populations, young snakes and salamanders?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a question I get quite often. And I have dreams of doing a project where we look at sort of turkey crop contents and turkey stomach contents to see just how much of their diet is consisting of herps. Because I know there's been some concern, especially on Point Pelee, about turkeys moving in and decimating the salamander populations that are already in trouble down there. What I can say is that turkeys are typically foraging during the day, and salamanders are typically active at night. So we have a difference in activity already. So I don't think that they're a significant predator. That being said, when they move through the landscape, they're pecking at kind of anything in their path. So if there's a small herp in the way, they may eat it. I don't think they're seeking herps by any means, but if there's one that's, you know, a colder day, maybe the salamander's moving a bit slower. If it was asleep under leaf litter and the turkeys flipped it up, would probably eat it just like it would eat any small insect. There's been one study out of Trent University that I know of that studied turkey peck marks on clay salamanders in the field to see if turkeys sort of are identifying that as a food source. They did pick at the clay salamanders. So we have evidence that they would attempt to eat them, but again, it's a clay salamander and sort of a manufactured environment. So we don't know for sure. But it's definitely something that's on my radar and something that we talk about a lot. Yeah, is whether it's a significant impact and why or why not. It's a great question.
Cool. Thank you, Peter Schultens, for bringing that up. Peter Tome was asking the questions about the harems, and he was quite excited to learn that it's not so much brother versus brother, Peter. It's like brother and brother.
Yes, yes, they're working together.
All right, Bruce McKenzie, the former bird study group director, asks, what is winter food in the northern area with deep snow?
Yeah, that's a good question. So lots of turkeys do starve during the winter at their northern periphery. They're still going to try to dig through that deep snow for natural food sources like plant parts and things like that. But during the winter, they definitely have a hard time in the north. So still bird feeders, still agricultural food sources. So on the Bruce Peninsula, for instance, that's sort of almost at their northern periphery. We see them heavily reliant on agricultural operations during the winter time and heavily reliant on bird feeders. Yeah, not a lot of natural food sources available. As we start to see less snow cover in the north with climate change, you know, their range may shift further north. It's probably what we'll see, but yeah, as of now, it's the food source. The deep snow covering their natural food sources is what's limiting their northern expansion. Yeah.
Do you have any recommendations about feeding if you've got turkeys hanging around your property? Is that frowned upon? Is that welcomed?
Yeah, so like any wildlife feeding, you want to be really mindful about the other sort of critters that you might attract. So turkeys will go to a bird feeder, a standing bird feeder, and they'll take advantage of the seed that's fallen to the ground. But as soon as you start to put feed on the ground, you'll attract other species. So at our bait piles, for instance, we see raccoons. On our trail cam, we see lots of deer coming through. So turkeys do love corn. If you put some corn out for your turkeys, they'll definitely appreciate it, but you may attract other species as well that you're maybe not targeting. So just something to keep in mind.
Feeding wildlife is a growing, topic. I mean, it always kind of has been, but I always wonder what experts in the field think or say or recommend about stuff like that. So thank you for that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, if I can just follow up on that, I would also like to say that it's important to keep in mind too, that if you start to supply a food source, you want to think about the long-term impacts of that. So if you start to feed turkeys this winter, you may be drawing them away from a natural food source that they are accustomed to using. And then if you're going to move next year, you may disturb sort of the dynamics of that system a little bit. So thinking about the food source as sort of a long-term investment, I guess, or thinking about the impacts of them long-term, I think is really important. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So Shay asks, other than great horned owls, what other raptor predators do turkeys have? And has this study given any valuable information about these predators?
Yeah, that's a good question. So In terms of aerial predators, honestly, it's just my best guess based on size. So I think probably like a red tail might be able to take down a small hen, and poults for sure. Lots of birds of prey, even the smaller ones, could take a poult off the ground, especially when they're flightless, which is why they're in the tall grass for most of the time when they're that small. But I think probably like maybe a great gray further north could take a small hen. Maybe some great horns in the south, but otherwise, I think most raptors are probably too small to grab adult turkeys where I study them anyways.
Cool. Lou says there was a single turkey hanging around on a suburban corner in a gas station for a few weeks. It became very popular actually in Burlington. They even gave it a name. I'm forgetting it now. Why would it have left its flock?
That's a good question. Yeah, so depends on the time of year. I don't know if you can let me know the time of year that you saw the bird. But if it's during the spring, I imagine it's just an individual who's looking for a good place to nest or looking for a female to mate with. I'm not sure about the sex either, but during spring, it's not sort of unusual for us to see these large dramatic movements through the landscape. I had one individual move 20 kilometers only to come all the way back. And so they're moving around, they're checking things out, doing a lot of exploration. And so I have a feeling it was probably an individual who was just kind of out on a journey to see what's available.
It was February 2nd.
Okay, yeah.
And it was like flying up and sitting on wires and on poles, walking around the road, like in a gas station, right in a really busy intersection. It was crazy.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's a little early for spring dispersal, but sometimes we start to see the flocks break up in February. Could be that there was a bird feeder nearby that he's been relying on. I know a lot of people that feed pigeons in urban areas also have started to feed the turkeys that move into urban areas. So it could have been a food source like that nearby that he's been taking advantage of. Sometimes they get distracted by their reflection and windows too. If it's nearing the mating season, they'll display and gobble at their own reflection. So it could have been something like that on the glass of the building as well.
Interesting. I'm going to go back for a quick sec. Glenn says, would turkeys be prey to eastern cougars? And Shay says, I'm wondering about northern goshawk. So kind of going back to the predator-prey relationship.
Yeah, I think a northern goshawk could take down a turkey for sure, especially a smaller one. Those big males get up to 20 pounds, but as I said, we've had hens as small as 3. So yeah, a northern goshawk could definitely take a smaller hen, and a cougar, absolutely. So a cougar would have no problem taking down a turkey, especially hens on their nests. So hens during nesting season is the highest predation that I see during the year when I study turkeys, because they are just so vulnerable. Also very smelly, because they're just sitting on the nest all day long, pooping right on the nest and hardly ever leaving. So if a predator gets a whiff of that, then yeah, they're food sitting on food.
It's funny to call it a nest. Your pictures made them just look like they just kind of plop their eggs down wherever they wanted. Like, was
Yeah,
that
yeah. They kind of do that, yeah.
So they don't build much. They don't even have a scrape or anything. Like it's just they just mat it down.
Pretty much, yeah. They don't really move the plant material too much. They just sort of pat it down, and sometimes there's a bit of a bowl. But yeah, they lay their eggs pretty much right on the ground.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna ask one more question, and then we're gonna swing into some of a similar topic. Bruce wants to know if there's an effect on grouse populations. So if turkeys have an effect on other bird populations. Grouses.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. Not that I've seen. I see grouse in my sort of turkey study area a lot, and there's lots of turkeys around. So just in my sort of anecdotal observations, it doesn't seem that the turkeys are driving the grouse away by any means. I see grouse relatively often, running across the road and in the same kind of habitats that the turkeys are taking advantage of. I have heard that before though. So I imagine that there are some anecdotes of maybe turkey grouse interactions. But yeah, not that I've seen. I have not seen any evidence of that.
Maybe it's kind of similar to like beaver and muskrat relationships where the one's bigger than the other, and they kind of just get along in each other's spaces. Who knows?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, these following questions are all kind of linked. So, can you tell us a little bit about the life expectancy of both male and female, and the rate of winter mortality? And this is from George.
Yes, so that's a great question. So in my study, I saw that natural causes of predation were higher in females, and during the nesting season primarily. So some mortality during the winter time in terms of predation. I didn't see any other causes of mortality. Actually, no, I saw one other cause of mortality. We had one individual with pox, just in a region just outside of Peterborough. So turkeys get avian pox. They get a specific sort of strain of avian pox. So we did have one individual with pox. He was in a flock with other birds, and none of the other birds showed symptoms. So we don't think that that was sort of a risk to introducing it into the landscape or anything like that. That was the sort of one other cause of mortality that we saw, but otherwise it was primarily predation, predation of hens during the nesting season, and then some during the winter. I also had a few males harvested by turkey hunters. So they are, when they take their turkey hunting course, they are told that they need to call the ministry if they harvest a tagged bird. So they call us, and then we go out and get the tag. And I like to chat with them a little bit about where they got the turkey and what the turkey was doing. If I can, I like to look at the bird too, because I like to see that there's no feathers missing where the tag's been sitting. And just to see how the bird looks, sometimes it's several years after we've caught them. And I'm happy to report that they always look really great. So I've never seen any evidence of the tags having any wear and tear on them or anything like that. And I have a really great working relationship with the turkey hunters in this area, I'm happy to say. So we're always able to sort of exchange information back and forth about the birds. But yeah, in terms of mortality rates, not super high. But if they are going to die, yeah, it's typically predators. Typically, a hen's sort of highest risk period is when she's on the nest, and overall, the second highest risk period would be during the winter, when all their other sort of predator species are also crunched for those natural food sources. So they're also a bit more bold, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
How long can one live for?
Yeah, so males can probably live to like 7 or 8 would be an old turkey. Females don't typically last quite as long though. I find that they're predated or they vanish, which I imagine means they're predated or some other cause of death, maybe around 4 or 5 years. My tags also don't last that long, so I'm making a bit of a guess about how old they were when I tagged them. But yeah, the males tend to persist a bit longer. I think that it's because they're bigger, so maybe they're more intimidating for predators to go after. But 7 or 8 would be definitely an old wild turkey.
Cool. Ian wants to know, how much do adult toms and hens weigh?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the biggest tom of the eastern wild turkey, which is the subspecies we have here, was something like 20 kilograms. So quite large. The toms that I'm catching are maybe between 10 and 15 kilograms. Jake's maybe 7 to 11, something like that. And then hens, which are our females, the smallest was 3. They're typically between maybe 4 and 6 kilograms. So the hens are quite a bit smaller.
So toms, what's the Jake again? Is the Jake a young male?
Yes, yes. Sorry, I'm throwing these turkey terms around, but yeah, Jake is a juvenile male. Yeah.
And sorry, what were you calling the young?
The hen is a young female, and a Jenny is a young, sorry, hen is an adult female and a Jenny is a young female.
Okay, and then the babies are colts?
Colts with a P.
Colts. I thought you said polts, and I wrote down colts with a question mark.
Yeah, colts with a P, just like poultry.
Gotcha. Okay, that's great. Thank you. So continuing along, Joyce wants to know, why are turkeys so iridescent? Is there an advantage to this?
That's a great question. Yeah, I don't have an answer for that. The males are definitely more iridescent than the females. So I imagine it's some sort of sexual selection thing that we're seeing. The females are selecting these beautiful iridescent males. there's a few hypotheses for that, why that might be. You know, it could be related to good genes, things like that. Maybe the prettier males have better genetic material and the hens are able to detect that. Birds also see in ultraviolet, so they look really beautiful to us, and they might look even more beautiful in that ultraviolet range. I'm not sure about wild turkeys specifically. I should get an ultraviolet light and shine it on my turkeys next time I trap them. Actually, it's a good suggestion. But I imagine it's a sexual selection thing, yeah, because the females are not nearly as iridescent. They're a much duller, more dull brown. Yeah.
Maybe something similar to like a common grackle or something.
Yeah,
How they have
exactly.
similar iridescence. Cool. Thanks,
Yeah.
Joyce. And I've wondered this myself. How far can they fly? So you know, I've had it before. Where it's like, oh, turkeys can't fly that far. You know, what can you speak to their flight and their length and anything like that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of how far they can fly, I've seen them fly over the Otonabee River in town, for instance, which is probably a couple hundred meters. And they need to get like quite a good lift to get over that river. So I'd say they can probably sustain flight for maybe even 300-400 meters. And then, yeah, they're going to come back down after that. But definitely they can kind of quickly take into the air to get up into a roost tree, things like that. Yeah. They are spending most of their time on the ground walking because their bodies are so hard to kind of get off the ground. And also in the winter, we see that rather than flying, they will take paths that are padded down. So in that first slide I showed, I can actually go back to it. One of the first slides that I showed with the snow packed down. So that's what I'm doing here is I'm packing the snow down to give them incentive to take that path because they're very easily convinced to take the path of least resistance through the landscape. So they'll definitely walk rather than fly, and they'll walk on sort of padded down snow rather than through fresh snow.
Interesting. That's good to know. As you were going through those slides, your footage of the exploding net, someone who's watching was texting me sharing that I'd love to do that. I'd love to see that someday. I'd even like to do that, and the joke was do that to a bunch of birders who are misbehaving and lure them in with an owl and they get too close, and then get them with the net and teach them why that maybe they shouldn't do something like that. But
Yes.
that does look kind of fun and interesting.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
So that rounds up the questions from folks. So maybe I'll just kind of ask a couple more. You know, what should birders in Hamilton keep in mind when they're seeing turkeys? You know, not just the amazing information that we've learned from you tonight, but you know, what's something that you want us to take away for the next couple of years as we're out in the field?
Yeah, that's such a lovely question. I think in seeing turkeys in Hamilton, what I think about when I hear about turkeys in urban areas is what's bringing them there. You know, what are those food sources that are bringing them there, and thinking critically about whether that's good for them. So is it good for us to have this species that we consider a forest generalist moving into urban areas? It's fun for us to see them up close for sure, but it might not be in their best interest to be moving into urban areas and taking advantage of bird feeders over natural food sources. They're large, so they're not going to be susceptible to cats in the same way that songbirds are, but definitely sort of interacting with humans and dogs and just other sort of urban wildlife in this urban environment that they're not necessarily adapted for is going to have a long-term impact on individuals' health and then population health. So just like introducing supplemental food sources, you know, you might be moving them away from food sources that are actually better for them long term. So thinking critically about where you're seeing them in the urban space and admiring them and you know, enjoying that you have the opportunity to see them, but also thinking critically about what that means for maybe the habitat around the urban area.
Cool. Yeah, I know that there are the few that do get themselves right into the heart of Hamilton. Where I typically see them are more on the outskirts. So there's several big farm fields surrounding the Coots Paradise Marsh. So I see a flock of from anywhere from 5 to 17 or 18 of them all together. Up in like the Stony Creek Mountain area, I saw a big flock of probably 25 or more, also in a big kind of open farm field with forests adjacent to it.
Yeah.
It's Peter's saying there's some thought that turkeys have spread the seeds of cultivated plants into neighboring forests, so that's likely another component of this.
Yeah.
We've seen 2 at Garth and Fennel area in the past 2 years, so that's again kind of that getting away from the farm area and into more urban areas. So yeah, there's definitely a lot around.
Yeah, and they do seem to be moving more and more into urban areas in the past couple of years, which is really interesting. We had some sightings in town at a bus stop. There were turkeys just hanging out inside of a sort of bus shelter in a pretty urban area in Peterborough as well. So yeah, they're definitely moving into cities.
And they got big honking talons. Like, should people be worried about that at all if they are encountering a turkey in their backyard all of a sudden? Like, people have this need to want to like help animals all over the place, and
Yeah.
in sometimes detrimental ways, and they might think like this, a turkey's in my backyard, so are they dangerous, do you think?
I don't think turkeys are dangerous, no. They do have these talons, but their talons are adapted for digging. So this is sort of really all they're meant to do. They don't have raptor talons that can break your skin as easily and hook into you or anything like that. When I'm handling the wild turkeys, it's not so much their feet I'm worried about, but their wings. So for me, because I'm getting up close to them, if a wing opens, I have been hit in the head with a wing a couple times, and that's much more sort of dangerous than their talons. So no, I don't think you're at any risk of having a dangerous encounter with a turkey in your backyard. If you sort of just run towards them and you're loud and big and scary, then they're likely to take off.
Gotcha. Good to know. Simon's saying there's a large flock in the Iroquois Heights Conservation Area and feeding in local yards counted 55 last CBC. That
Oh,
that does beat the record of
yeah.
Bob Curry's book of 51. So now you got to beat 55, Simon. Cool. Okay, so lastly, what's next for Jenn? What's next for you in the birding world? Where can we expect to see you in the coming years? What's exciting you about birding these days?
Yeah, I love that question too. So I have some other turkey questions. So once I wrap up my PhD, my supervisor and I have talked a little bit about how we might address those other turkey questions. So things like the herp, the proportion of herps that are contributing to their diet. Perhaps we'll investigate that a little bit more. But I really have just fallen in love with these ground birds. So I would be happy to study perhaps grouse, or ptarmigan, something like that. Those little, round little ground birds, they have my heart now. So I think I'll continue to study them for as long as I can. Definitely would like to stay in the bird world for as long as I can, because I think they're just so fascinating. And once you start studying birds, I think just the research questions, they just start coming. So yeah, hopefully galliforms, but birds for sure.
I think you do owe us the data that you talked about, that you're going to be getting maybe before Christmas. We'd love,
I hope that's my Christmas present this year, is my genetics data. Yeah.
if you're able to follow up with me when you get any of that data, we'd be able to share it with folks if that's cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
And you do keep an active website.
Yes.
Would you mind typing that into the chat for folks,
Yeah, I can do
so
that.
that they can,
Absolutely.
which we will also share when Michael, our esteemed wood duck writer for the bird study group, writes up his awesome article.
Yes.
Hopefully we'll
Yeah,
include
that's
that.
so great.
Cool. And so do you have, this is my last question and then we'll really wrap up. Do you have any bird that you're hoping to see before the end of the year that has eluded your list for 2021?
Well, I saw northern shrike on that list. I would love to see a northern shrike. I've actually never seen one in the wild, so that would be amazing. Yeah, I think that's on my list. And a snowy as well. I was lucky enough to see quite a few snowies during the last eruption year. So if I could see one again this year, that would be amazing too.
Wicked. All right. Well, I think that's it. People have been saying thanks in the chat and for sure in their in their brains. This has been awesome. We've all learned so much more about wild turkeys because of you and your awesome research and great presentation. So
Thank you so much, Jackson.
Yeah. So we'd love to have you back again another time, another year perhaps.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
and send folks our way. We do this once a month. So we'd love to just keep talking about what's happening out there. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
And to everyone who's still here, enjoy the rest of your year. Have a safe and happy holiday season. And maybe next year Hamilton will win the Grey Cup. With that, so long, everybody. We'll see you again. See you, Jen.